My mother-in-law called me the help at her gala in front of 200 people, and she said it like it was a compliment. I said it plain, and I said it to the room. She laughed. People laughed with her. I could feel the laughter fold around me like a hand closing. It wasn't the word that hit me first. It was the way she said it. Small, casual, with the kind of amused affection you reserve for pets or cashiers. We had been standing under strings of amber bulbs in a ballroom at the country club. Evelyn in a sequin dress that swallowed the light. Me in a borrowed dress whose hem I'd mended in the bathroom 5 minutes before. She put a hand on my arm and called me the help. And the sound of it was a dismissal and an invoice at once. I had been invisible and then rendered transactional in the same breath. That hurt because it was true in the worst way it could be true, stripped of pretense and given to other people to approve. She did it because she wanted to show her friends something simple, that she had a life where everything worked, including a tidy woman who took care of the messy parts. She did it because she could. It hurt me because I had spent 8 years making sure everything worked for her, and no one in that room knew that when she toasted family, she meant the comfortable public family and not the messy, intimate ledger behind the curtains. We live 3 blocks from the country club. My husband Mark and I bought a small townhouse 5 years before with one of those 20-year low-interest mortgages that feels like a contract with a better future. Mark works in commercial real estate. He is good at numbers and softer with people. Evelyn, his mother, had always been useful in a way I learned to resent. She taught my husband how to like high ceilings and provided introductions when he needed them. She did not teach him how to argue or how to put his foot down. That part came to me. The arrangement started simple. Evelyn had a mild stroke the winter of 2019. She got better in ways that looked like improvements, but left her with a steadier hand for social things than for the kind of everyday details that make a household run. Mark's sister lives in another state and had no bandwidth. Mark works long hours. We offered to have her move in for a while. It was a favour. It was temporary. I was pregnant then. I learned how to make split pea soup with a blender and how to pay a nurse by cash. Temporary became routine in small steps. I learned how to read an EOB. I learned Medicare codes. I started going to the pharmacy and the post office, and then to the bank to sign checks, and then, without fanfare, to the financial planner because she needed help with paperwork. She liked that phrase, paperwork. It made everything sound less intimate. The mortgage, the gardener, the men who came to repair the windows, I handled those. I paid the trust accountant's invoices and the housekeeper and the electrician. I wrote checks with my handwriting and left them on a tray. I had receipts for everything. We could not simply leave for 1,000 sensible reasons. Mark's income fluctuates with the cycles of deals. I had taken a step back from my career to be home with our first child and then to manage Evelyn while she recovered. The townhouse was small and our neighbourhood was okay for schools and for Mark's commute. Evelyn's doctor told us she would do better with family nearby. There were also informal promises. Evelyn would use the house in the winter and let us use her lake cottage in the summer. It was a web of favours, half-spoken obligations and quiet calculations. Add to that the fact that Mark was the only child living near her. He felt it was his duty. I felt like I had no moral right to abandon someone who had once brought rice pudding on a rainy day when Mark was a kid, but duty, as I came to know it, is porous. You can walk through it if someone on the other side is pulling a different rope. The first time she trimmed me publicly, it was not dramatic. It was at a small birthday dinner 2 years after she moved in. I was carrying a tray and she stopped me mid-corridor with a remark about my blouse. "Oh, darling, you're in that thrift store silk again. Isn't she adorable? The help always dresses like this." A few people at the table smiled. I smiled back. Inside, I felt a small hot knot of shame. I had bought that blouse for $12 off a street vendor because we were short that month on childcare, and I thought a new blouse would make me feel like I still had a self that belonged in public view. I paid for groceries and the pediatrician copay that week. Later, in the bedroom, Mark said quietly that she had not meant it, that Evelyn gets funny. He asked me to let it go. Letting it go became the rule. Each time it got easier for everyone else and harder for me. Her friends took it as an example of Evelyn's wit. Her staff took it as permission. I started hearing the phrase, "the help," in other places, in text messages that called me our helper, and in the way her assistant scheduled my time. She began to refer to me when introducing people as our girl, as if I were both her property and their small amusement. I stood at the edge of dozens of small humiliations and learned to calibrate my reactions the way sailors learn to read tides. The point was always to stay useful without being too useful. Escalation happened in loops of small and then bigger cruelties. The first loop was financial pressure. Evelyn liked expensive things. That was not news. The problem was that she liked public displays of wealth at other people's expense. She decided I must have the right gown for her gala. Not must as a suggestion, but must, with a look that never asked permission. "You'll wear that green dress," she said once, tapping a fashion magazine I could not afford. "It's clean lines and quietly expensive. People will think you belong." I did not have a green dress in that price bracket. I bought a dress on sale for $300, a big bill for us, and told myself it was a one-time expense. Then she invited a stylist over, and when the stylist placed a rhinestone choker at my throat, she said to the room, "You should be grateful. Not everyone gets a choker." I paid for alterations. That night, she announced loudly, "We're all family here. I like to keep my family presentable." My reaction was small. I resisted the urge to say what I wanted, that I had paid for the dress and that I would pay for my own things. Instead, I smiled. And later, I counted receipts in the kitchen while the washer hummed the choker on the counter. The consequence was an expanding list of suggestions from her. "Could you drive me to the spa? Our piano tuner is coming on Thursday. Could you be home? The pool man needs a check." Every suggestion became another charge on our account. There were wires to her, transfers from our credit card to pay the housekeeper, money for groceries, money that I logged in a spreadsheet I kept on my phone with columns titled Evelyn and Paid By. The next escalation was exclusion and manipulation. When Mark and I had a son, Evelyn started to act as though she had been the architect of everything that was good in his life. She made sure her name appeared on every thank you note she could influence. She called pediatricians by name at dinner parties and told stories where Mark was the hero and I was a bit actor. I tried to correct her once in front of her friends, mild, a single sentence, and she shifted the story midstream and made me look like a woman who was unappreciative. "Isn't she sweet?" she said, patting my arm. But she's young. Some things only come with age. My reaction to exclusion always tried to be practical. I would stew and then call the accountant and ask for copies of invoices. I arranged for a neighbour to pick up prescriptions when she forgot. The consequence was always deeper involvement. The more I tried to step back, the more responsibility slid onto me in ways that looked like help to the outside world and like maintenance to me. Her staff began to call me first. Her lawyer called me to ask about a form. I felt both flattered and trapped. The situation got worse because help, when rendered without boundaries, becomes invisible labor that your social circle mistakes for loyalty. Humiliation came next in sharper forms. At a Memorial Day brunch at her place, she corrected the way I held a casserole dish. At a board meeting for a small charity she ran, she introduced me as the woman who keeps my life in order. And the chair laughed a short, dismissive laugh that I recognized as permission not to take me seriously. Those laughs were daily micro-assaults. They wore at me. I stopped offering opinions at the table. I learned to nod in a certain pattern that said supportive spouse instead of intelligent partner. Then came pressure, wrapped in consequences. There was a period of 6 months when Mark's firm had a dry spell and the numbers looked grim. We tightened our budget. I stopped taking the Pilates classes and I started splitting grocery lists. Evelyn, unbothered in her public life, did not miss a dinner or a gift. In private, she began to suggest that maybe we should help her with some of her bills. It was framed as an invitation. "It's family after all," she said one morning, like she was offering us pie. I understood what she meant. It was not reciprocity, it was debt. I said no the first time. The second time I asked Mark to sign the rent check. He did with a blank face, saying nothing about whether it would come from his account this month or from a transfer from Evelyn's. That blank face, I learned, meant he was afraid. He was afraid of saying no to her the way he had been afraid to say no in childhood. My reaction to fear was fury, which I tried to keep hidden because fury made everything worse. The consequence of my fury was the slow erosion of marital intimacy. We spoke in business terms. We had schedules where nothing tender could be scheduled and nothing domestic could be spontaneous. The situation got worse because resentment is a slow leak. It does not announce itself. You do not notice your tire is flat until you are bent under a coat of gravel. But at one point, she tightened the rules about the lake cottage. "We'll be using it next summer," she announced in January. "You can visit, of course." The subtext was price and control. Her boat had a captain. Her guests were all suitably glossy. We were allowed, politely, to place our heads on her couch if she deemed it convenient. The consequence was that after a year of these small incursions, we had paid for a series of renovations at her house. New windows, a rebuilt deck. I found a set of invoices in a folder accidentally left at her kitchen counter. They were in my handwriting, but on her stationery. They bore my signature as an approver and a bank transfer number that traced back to our account. So she had been charging our credit line and then reimbursing it with checks that never cleared because they were written later to cover a different expense. There was a loop, and I was stuck in the loop. There were lies too. She told our mutual friends that she paid for our wedding shower. Not because she had, but because she wanted the public credit. She also told people at the country club that we were doing very well, as if our struggles were a costume to accentuate her success. When I tried to correct her in private, she called me ungrateful. When I tried to correct her in public, she smiled and made me the comic relief. The consequences were a slow liquidation of my dignity, being made small so others could feel large. At the gala, when she called me the help, a new loop began. The insult landed in public and in private. It was one of those gestures that made the room agree with her sense of order. I could have left. I did not. I sat down and I held the champagne flute until my knuckles whitened. People discussed the band and the auction items. The MC told the story of Evelyn's charity and how she had raised millions for a children's wing. People applauded, and she looked at me like she had just offered a puzzle to a favored niece. I thought about leaving because I had thought about it for years, but there was a small, practical voice inside me, a ledger voice, that said this: you have 6 years of accounting for her expenses on a hard drive in the house office. You have PDFs of transfers and a stack of cancelled checks in the file labeled household. You have stamps for checks you wrote. You have invoices and a trail. There was a legal sense of leverage in those documents. You do not need to be loud. You need to be undeniable. The immediate reaction was not theatrical. I did not stand on a chair or shout. I slid out of my seat between two men who were discussing table linens. I walked across the ballroom and into the small, quiet coat room where the staff kept extra place settings. There was a janitor folding napkins. I asked where the manager of the event was. He pointed through a narrow door, and there she was, Evelyn, smiling, like she always smiled when she was in motion. I had a small stack of papers folded in my hand, the kind of legal-sized printouts that gnawed at their edges when you held them too long. They were bank transfers, PDFs, outgoing wires, merchant receipts. I said quietly, "You left the bank ledger open on your desk." I took copies. She blinked as if made transparent for a moment. Then she smoothed her expression. "Claire," she said, as if calling me by name were a balm. "This is not the time." I had practiced the voice I would use for years in my head. It is a voice I had learned at the pediatrician's office, in the hush with a crying infant, a voice that is not shrill and will not invite ridicule. I said, "There is no reason to keep making me invisible. You call me the help." People here think that my job is to fasten your shawl. I'd like for everyone to know what I actually do. She laughed in that small, careful way. She put a hand to her chest as if she had been wounded by my impertinence. "You'll embarrass me." I handed the manager the stack. I did not say anything else. The manager looked at the documents, then at Evelyn. There was a long, thin pause. I could hear the band muffled in the ballroom. I could hear the clink of glassware. People at nearby tables were beginning to notice a disturbance. I felt the old, familiar heat of shame, but also something else. A coldness that has nothing to do with dignity and everything to do with accounting. By midnight, people were whispering. Some guests had left, some remained, their faces blurred and uncertain. A woman from the board came over and said, "Evelyn, is everything okay?" Evelyn's mask faltered for a second. I saw fear cross her face, not for herself, but for her control. She was good at control. She had always been good at it. That was the source of her power. The next morning, the first consequence was social. The club's board opened a quiet inquiry. People who had toasted her charity called to ask about checks she had raised. The local paper smelled something and called the office. It was not a scandal overnight, but it was a slow leak that darkened her edges. Her friends who had believed the image began to ask questions. The woman who had insisted she host the gala sent a text that said simply, "Are you okay?" Mark called me and his voice was small in a way that made me ashamed and proud at the same time. He said, What did you do? I tried to tell him without anger. He told me he was proud and then asked me why I had chosen to do it that way. He said he loved me between the question and the praise, and his voice trembled like a child's. The private consequences were worse for me at first. Evelyn called me and we talked on the phone. She used the word betrayal. She said, you took my privacy. She said, you left me no choice. She said it with the kind of wounded gravity that makes people yield. I felt small and grand in the same conversation. She accused me of grandstanding. I accused her of using language as a weapon. It did not help. The real turning came not at the gala, but 2 weeks later when Mark, pushed by his own shame and a phone call from his sister, went into Evelyn's walk-in closet to get a sweater and found something he was not supposed to find. It was a set of documents in a manila envelope labeled "Personal for Review." He opened it because, as much as people like to draw clean lines, people also look into other people's things when the ground shifts. In the envelope were ledgers that mapped the last 8 years of Evelyn's finances in a way that made the public life an unsustainable fiction. There were monthly reimbursements from our account to her vendors. There were checks that had been written back and forth in a confusing choreography. There were also emails printed out where she wrote to her accountant, "Mark is reliable. Claire will handle the wiring." There was a line item that made my stomach drop. The housekeeper's salary had been paid in large part by transfers that originated from my account with notes like "payment for maintenance." There was a ledger entry showing that the renovations we thought she had paid for had been billed to our line of credit and then reimbursed via checks that were later used for other purposes. The enclosed bank statements also contained a glaring mistake. Evelyn's charity account had a line where a grant check bounced and had been covered by a transfer from an account labelled with Mark's business. Someone had misposted it to the wrong category. It looked like bookkeeping error. It looked like fraud if you were unsympathetic. It was not my place to call it one or the other. It was my place to see it and to understand that the story we had been given, that she was a benefactor, was subsidized in complicated ways by the family. Mark was pale when he came to the kitchen. He sat down and pushed the papers toward me as if performing a sacrament. He said, "I didn't know." He had not, or he had chosen not to know. That was true in the tender, awful way that many people choose to ignore certain truths to maintain a family narrative. He was angry then. He was shaking. We were angry in different ways. I was furious that the ledger had even existed. He was furious that his mother had been using the family like a revolving door of favors. The turning point was not a shouted confession. It was a mistake, the kind that finally opens a locked door. He had opened the envelope because he had been looking for a sweater. The universe is careless that way. It hands you the evidence you need as if you were owed it. What followed was negotiation and consequence. We did not go to the tabloids. We did not crash into legal spectacle. We started with small, reasonable steps. Mark called a lawyer. I demanded copies of every bank statement. Evelyn hired her own lawyer. There were meetings at a table with coffee and paper cups, with voices that tried not to shake. Evelyn claimed she had managed everyone's finances as a kindness. People said things like, "I did it for family." We all sounded like people stepping around hot coals. There was a cost. The board on which Evelyn sat asked for auditing. Some donors paused their contributions, unwilling to associate with Swirl. The country club called and asked for an explanation, not legalese, but appearances. The consequences hummed outward from our little knot. Evelyn's name lost something, not ruin, not that, but a brush that dulled the shine. Her friends stopped dropping by unannounced. Invitations that had been pliant turned stiff. Within 3 months, we arranged a mediated accounting. It was awkward and painfully precise. Every transfer found a home in the ledger. Some of the transfers were legitimate mistakes. Some were reimbursements made late. Some were payments that had been asked for and accepted. The mediator's office smelled like lemon cleaner, and the chair had that kind of impartial authority that makes you tell the truth in small increments. The outcome was less dramatic than the moment at the gala had promised. There was no confiscation of property, no immediate public shaming. There was an agreement in which Evelyn acknowledged, in a formal document, that certain payments had been made from our accounts for household and property expenses and agreed to remit a repayment plan for the period where the transfers were clearly compensatory. We did not get everything back. Accounting is rarely an instrument of full justice. Money moves in circles and names on papers mean less than you think. But we got a change in behaviour. She agreed to stop asking us to cover her monthly bills, and she agreed to hire a financial manager independent of family accounts. She agreed to send invoices to a shared email for transparency. Those were small changes that mattered. They were boundaries. They were, in their way, repairs. The emotional consequences were sharper. Mark and I had to rebuild trust. He was ashamed of his passivity and angry at his mother. I was tender toward him and furious at the way his default was to protect his mother. We went to counselling. That deserves the note that there were no grand apologies. People do not reform like characters in movies. There were apologies with qualifiers, pauses that smelled of old customs. Mark said, "I am sorry," and in the same breath explained why he had acted as he did. Evelyn said, "I am sorry," and then asked if we could go to the lake the following weekend. We are human. We want things. There were social consequences too. A few friends remained distant. A woman who had been Evelyn's closest friend sent a note saying she needed space. The club quietly moved Evelyn to a different committee. Some donors redirected checks to other causes. For a time, Evelyn lost the sense of effortless social capital. She had to earn respect without the full glow of unquestioned generosity. In time, the practical things changed as well. We stopped paying certain bills. Mark consolidated accounts. We adjusted our budget and the mortgage. The cottage went into a trust fund arrangement that clarified who was responsible for upkeep. It is not dramatic. It is paperwork and quiet conversations. But it is durable. The anonymity of kindness, the thing Evelyn had counted on, no longer protected the ledger. The low point, the quiet, heavy loss, came for me, not in the courtroom, but in a small hallway at home, when I found myself sitting on the stairs with the baby monitor in my lap, listening to Mark and his mother argue about whether we should keep the housekeeper. They were speaking in the flat tones of people who negotiate their comforts like commodities. I felt abandoned and small. I had lost my leverage. I had been reduced to the woman with the receipts. I felt like a collector of proof without the loudness that might have made it matter. The child slept upstairs. The house smelled like lemon and fabric softener. I cried, not out of rage, but out of exhaustion for the life that had been siphoned off by obligation and for the slow necessary work of reclaiming it. The turning point, though, allowed a different kind of consequence, a reassignment of roles. We insisted on a new financial arrangement. We insisted on independent accounting for her charity. We insisted on invoices and an assigned fiduciary. There were no dramatic arrests or televised confrontations, only a series of practical steps that removed Evelyn's ability to fold us into the background of her expenses. She was still proud and still sharp. She still liked the ribbons on new hats, but she could no longer call me the help, with the comfortable assumption that my labour would continue without record. There were moral shifts that were quieter. Mark started saying no in small ways. He stopped answering his mother at 2 a.m. He started coming to dinner on time. I stopped doing things that were not mine. I learned how to refuse without collapsing. That is a skill that is quiet and takes time to acquire. At first, it simply looked like boundary setting. Over months, it looked like a marriage that had reclaimed a voice. The payoff was not dramatic. It was not a scene of righteous triumph. It was a mortgage refinance we did without guilt. It was Mark taking our son to soccer without first calling his mother for permission. It was Evelyn accepting that she would have to hire a manager for some of her projects and paying for that manager herself. It was also the way my friends looked at me differently, with a new measure of curiosity and kindness rather than dismissiveness. They had always known something was off. Now there were papers that matched their perceptions. Evelyn did not vanish. She did not become a cautionary tale. She remained a person with sharp edges and an abiding love for certain kinds of order. She asked for forgiveness in ways that were partial and practical, a check in small amounts, a note at Christmas that felt like a hand extended rather than grasped. We accepted some of it because we were not trying to erase her. We were trying to live without being used. I do not tell this story as a capstone of revenge. I tell it because there is a particular kind of invisible labor that masquerades as family, and because humiliation given in public is often designed to reestablish a household hierarchy. I am not naive enough to think that money resolves everything. It does not. It makes other things possible. It allows for choices. It allows for exit routes. Sometimes the most radical act is simply insisting that a family ledger match actual life. What I learned is that preparation matters. When you keep receipts, you are not simply documenting expenses. You are keeping a map of the places where your time and money have gone. That map is not always pretty. It does not make a bad person good overnight. What it does do is make conversation possible. It turns gossip into accounting. And accounting, in a strange way, is respectful. It treats people as responsible for their own debts. There are no fairy tales here. Evelyn still hosts dinners and sometimes she forgets. Sometimes she lapses back into old habits. We remind her with gentle, firm notes. There are no explosive endings. There are instead a series of small adjustments that keep the family from collapsing into a script that profits someone else's dignity at the expense of another's labor. If you stayed with me this long, you know the debt of the story is not just financial. It is the debt of recognition. It is the desire to be known as more than a helper and the courage to render the ledger public when the humiliation becomes too sharp. I am still someone who irons shirts and goes to school concerts. I am also a woman who kept track of where money went and used that record when I needed to ask for a different life. If anything about this resonated with you, please leave a like. If you want to hear more stories like this, consider subscribing. And if you've ever been called something in public that didn't match who you are, I'd love to hear about it in the comments.